Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Sharks forwards playoff grades. And a couple things before I do get started. For one, I do have Micheal Haley on the list here. He did play 11 games, so I felt the need to at least have him on the board. Lukáš Radila, on the other hand, who only played 6 games, I did not decide to include in this, so there is only 13 forwards. And then the second thing, which will affect more players here, is injuries. Obviously, there were a lot of players on this board right now who dealt with injuries during the playoffs. Players like Pavelski, potentially Kane, Hertl, and Donskoy, and a bunch of players, Thornton as well. But I will not consider those injuries when I do give these players their grades. I don't know the extent of how the injuries really impacted them, and so I'm just going purely on how they performed on the ice, and that here starts with Joe Pavelski. Of course, you could argue that during the St. Louis series that there were some injuries that he may have been playing through. But when it comes to Pavelski, he did have 9 points over the 13 games, so really all not that bad. Missed the first 6 games of the Avalanche series, but in Game 7 performed very, very well with the goal to get the game going, as well as the primary assist on the second goal to give the Sharks a 2-0 lead. But after that, on that second line with Kane and Hertl, a line filled with 30 goal scorers from the regular season, they had an extremely ineffective St. Louis series. No even strength goals for them, even though Pavelski did get one on a 5-on-3. But otherwise, Pavelski, not a great series against the Blues. Was very good in the one game he played against the Avalanche, and was okay during the Golden Knights series. So all in all, Pavelski will get a decent grade, but maybe you expected slightly more from him when I give him a B-. Next is Evander Kane, who was also part of that ineffective second line, except for before that second line was put together, before Pavelski returned from injury and everything, Evander Kane was also a part of, seemed to be on an ineffective line throughout the entirety of the playoffs because he was always on it. So he only scored 2 goals during the full 20 games, considering he was a 30-goal scorer. That is extremely disappointing. He had a couple of okay games through the playoffs, or at least I should say a couple of quite good games. Obviously, I think it was he had the first goal of Game 2 against the Avalanche. I guess that's decent. He had a very nice goal, and I think it was Game 1 against the Golden Knights. But besides that, there were a few good or okay games here or there, and a few not great games here or there. But the fact of the matter is if you're only scoring 2 goals as a 30-goal scorer, and you're being given a good 18 minutes a night, DeBoer is leaning on you to actually be able to put up some scoring, and you're just not doing anything about it. You are, of course, going to get a pretty bad grade when you can't perform, and that's what Kane did, and as such, he's going to get the grade of a D+. Next is Gustav Nyquist, and once Joe Pavelski went down with injury, he joined Logan Couture and Timo Meier on the first line, a first line that would last for the rest of the playoffs, or almost the rest of the playoffs. I don't know if these 3 were together for Game 6 against the Blues. I don't entirely recall, but they played the majority of the rest of the playoffs together, and they were the Sharks' most consistent line through that. Obviously, Nyquist wasn't as good or as effective as Logan Couture and Timo Meier was on that line, but he was still quite good. The issue with Nyquist and why he'll have lower grades than Meier and Couture would be the fact that he only had a single goal through these playoffs, which I think was Game 1 against the Avalanche, if I'm not mistaken. So 1 goal through the 20 games is pretty unacceptable, I have to say, but he did still have 10 assists, so it wasn't all that bad. A decent trade deadline acquisition for the San Jose Sharks. I wouldn't say it wasn't worth it in the end. I still think it was a decent move to make to try and go for a push for the Stanley Cup. It seemingly almost worked out, so still a solid playoffs for Gustav Nyquist, and he'll get the grade of a B. Next is Micheal Haley, and this is a pretty difficult player to evaluate because there weren't really many expectations for Haley. If I was going to dock grades from any person, it would probably be DeBoer for just inserting Haley into so many games. Obviously, there were times where it was unavoidable injuries for the San Jose Sharks, but there were also games where he played over Jonas Donskoy or played over Marcus Sorenson, which I didn't really like. Only ended up with about 5 to 6 minutes a night for the majority of these playoffs. There was one game where he got to double-digit minutes, which was the final game against the St. Louis Blues. But Haley, he did exactly what he was advertised to do, which is basically nothing. He didn't get a single point during these playoffs, but again, I can't really dock him for that because it's hard to expect much more from him. And as such, I'll give him the grade of a C, but it just sort of feels weird in general evaluating him. Next is Thornton, who had a pretty good playoffs to start with. He was probably one of the Sharks' better players through the bad start against the Golden Knights through his games. I guess you could count one, even though that was a victory. But I guess 2-4, although he was suspended in Game 4 against the Golden Knights. But after that, from the Avalanche series onwards, it was somewhat disappointing. He obviously had a very good Game 1 against the Avalanche and a very good Game 3 against the St. Louis Blues. But besides that, he was mostly ineffective and even at times a liability for the Sharks. And so potentially the grueling schedule came up with him. Obviously, the Sharks played a tough 82 games and then 2 7-game series against, Golden Knights, a very tough opponent. And so, Joe Thornton, maybe that all caught up with him. It would have been better if the Sharks could get some more rest in the playoffs. But there were too many games where Thornton was mostly a passenger, and as such, I do have to give him the grade of a C+. Still have to commend him for 10 points through 20 games, but just too many games where he just didn't do much. Next is Marcus Sorenson, who was the line mate for Joe Thornton for the majority of this season, not just these playoffs. And Marcus Sorenson was relied on through the first half of the playoffs to actually do something, be on this third line, but he never really showed up. And so in the second half of the playoffs, even at time he was a healthy scratch, but otherwise he was barely even getting to double-digit minutes sometimes. And Sorenson ended up with 0 goals during these playoffs. Besides Micheal and I guess Melchor Carlson, he was the only player in the top 9 for the Sharks with 0 goals for them. And so that was pretty disappointing to see, honestly enough. Not to say that I was expecting so much from Marcus Sorenson, but he had a very good playoffs back last year when he was on the fourth line, but maybe this bit of an increased role that he had got to him a bit, I guess you could say, and he just wasn't necessarily good enough to show up consistently. He had an okay game in Game 1 against the Avalanche. Of course, the full third line for the Sharks was very good. But after that, 0 goals. I said that multiple times now, but 0 goals is a huge part. And so Marcus Sorenson was somewhat disappointing. He was at times a liability defensively as well, and as such, he will get a Evander Kane grade of a D+. Next is Barclay Gaudreau, who only scored 2 goals, didn't have a single assist during these playoffs. And, his fourth line was okay at times. His fourth line wasn't great at times. His penalty kill, maybe not his penalty kill, but the penalty kill he is a part of, wasn't great against the Golden Knights, but then was very good for the majority of the rest of the playoffs, the entirety of the Avalanche series, and then everything up to Game 6 against the St. Louis Blues I thought was quite strong for the penalty kill. So you do have to give him marks there. And of course, he did score probably the biggest goal of the playoffs for the San Jose Sharks this year, which was that Game 7 victory winner over the Golden Knights in overtime. So he does get marks for that. I can't give a player who scored that big of a goal for the Sharks that bad of a grade. And so while he wasn't that effective on the fourth line necessarily, it's again, he gets the buff from the fact that he had those 2 important game winners, including the huge one in Game 7. And so he'll end up with a B-. Next is Jonas Donskoy, who didn't play that much in these playoffs. At times he was a healthy scratch, at times he was injured. But when he was playing, he wasn't relied on all too much. He had a few games where he was in the top. I think he played top 6, second line in that final game against the Blues, which he was actually pretty decent in, honestly enough. When he was given an expanded role, he was normally pretty good. When he wasn't given much of a role, he wasn't that great. And so all in all, it was sort of like the regular season for Jonas Donskoy, where he was okay, but he was never really that strong. And so I feel as though I have to give him the grade of a C-, as it was still somewhat disappointing, but I guess it wasn't as bad as someone like Sorenson. At least he still got a goal. But moving on to Timo Meier, obviously played a big part on that first line. As I said, this was probably the Sharks' most consistent line from the Avalanche series onwards. Was very good through these playoffs. 5 goals and 10 assists, I believe, for 15 points through the 20 games. Probably could have gotten more points than that if he could bury a few more of his fantastic chances. So I must commend Timo Meier for that. And so he'll get one of the better grades of all the forwards for the Sharks when he receives an A-. Next is, of course, Logan Couture, a very good playoffs for Couture. I believe he actually still leads the league in playoffs. Of course, there's only been one game of the Stanley Cup Finals for teams to pass him, but still very impressive. He was, on the short track to winning the Conn Smythe if the Sharks could even, make it to the Stanley Cup Finals and win it. Even in a loss, he could have potentially come close like he did in 2016. So a very, very good playoffs for Logan Couture. He wasn't spotty necessarily. There weren't just a couple games here or there where he was very, very good. And let's say like Joe Thornton, he was mostly strong through the majority of the games that the Sharks did play. And the only issue, and that what probably keeps him from that A+, was the last 3 games against the St. Louis Blues. Game 4, Game 5, Game 6. The Sharks needed Logan Couture. Obviously, he was there for them for the majority, and so it's hard to blame him all too much for not showing up for a few games. But those were some pretty key games to not show up for, and Couture wasn't really there. He wasn't really apparent, especially in that Game 6 when Hertl, Carlson, and Pavelski were all injured. You were hoping for Couture to have a big game, and it just didn't really happen. And so as such, he won't get the A+, but he'll still get a very, very strong A. Next is Tomas Hertl, who also had a lot of points during the playoffs. I believe 16, if I'm not mistaken, with a good chunk of goals as well. But the difference between Couture and Hertl is that Hertl really actually did have spotty production. So during the Avalanche series, he had, I believe it was 6 points during the 7 games, which seems pretty good. But his Game 2, even with 2 assists, wasn't that strong. And he was only really that great in Game 5 and 7 of that series. And against the Blues, he had, I believe, the goal in Game 4, but still no even strength goal. He was a part of that ineffective second line, and he had a pretty strong series against the Golden Knights, you have to say that. But he just was sort of ineffective from the Avalanche series onwards. During those 13 games, he probably was only very good during maybe 2 or 3 of them, and so that was actually rather disappointing to see. So the points do still give him a very solid grade, but not in the A territory like Meier and Couture find themselves. Hertl will get a B+. Next is Kevin Labanc, the third member of that third line, and we saw something interesting from Labanc is that when he was given a lane to the net to be able to shoot, he was actually rather consistently able to bury that. He's got a fantastic shot. We saw him score a couple of goals like this against Grubauer, against Bennington, against Marc-Andre Fleury. We also saw him, hit a few posts, so he could have potentially had a bit more. He was rarely missing the net when it came to these very good shots, but the issue is that he's still a player who can't necessarily create those chances by himself. He can't get lost in the defensive zone, avoiding coverage necessarily, and so it seems as though it takes the other team having a defensive breakdown compared to, Labanc actually being able to make something happen necessarily. He did have that very nice one going through the legs of Rantanen and setting that up against the Avalanche, but besides that, it felt like everything sort of had to fall into place for Labanc to be able to get a good chance and be able to bury it, compared to Labanc actually creating it himself. And so there were a lot of games during these playoffs where he was somewhat ineffective, and so he will join Joe Thornton, his line mate, when he gets the grade of a C+. Next is Melchor Carlson, and all the things I said about the fourth line when I talked about Barclay Gaudreau still applies here. But the thing is that you do hope for your fourth line to be better than what the Sharks' fourth line was during these playoffs. I mean, just taking a look at the 2 final teams in the playoffs, the St. Louis Blues have their fourth line of Sundqvist, Barbashev, and Steen were very good against the San Jose Sharks. Obviously, you can't expect your fourth line to score a goal basically every game like that Blues fourth line did, but every shift they were playing very effective hockey, and they were getting actually pretty solid minutes for a fourth line, over a dozen minutes at times for each of those players. And you take a look at the Boston Bruins on the Eastern Conference side, they've got Corrali, Achari, and Wagner or Nordstrom. Or 3 of those 4 players are on their fourth line. And if you watched Game 1 Stanley Cup Finals, the Bruins' fourth line came up huge for them, and they've actually had a few good games during these playoffs. So you need your fourth line to be effective enough through the majority of the games. And while, of course, Gaudreau scored those 2 big goals, besides that, there were only a few solid games for the fourth line, and so it was a bit disappointing to see. And as such, Melchor Carlson will get a lower grade than Barclay Gaudreau because of the fact that he didn't have those huge goals when he gets the grade of a C. But that will do it. As these grades basically show, is that the first line for the Sharks, Couture, Meier, and Nyquist, were very good through the majority of this series, but there were just a few too many passengers. Players like Kane, players like Thornton, players like Labanc, Sorenson just were not consistent enough through the majority of these playoffs. The Sharks' depth, as I've mentioned multiple times in multiple other videos, just wasn't good enough during these playoffs. And so when they came across a team like the St. Louis Blues who could punish them in that regard, they managed to do so, and the Sharks could not respond. Class dismissed.